Middle Way Philosophy, Introductory Video 6a, Integration of Desire, Healing of Inner and Outer Conflict by Robert M. Ellis. This is a tributary video to video number 6 in the series on integration. Desire is a very basic experience of human life, whether it's for a person, for consumer goods, whether it's an addiction that we may be struggling with, or perhaps it's an ambition for future glory. All these things may feel like healthy desires at times, but we also struggle with them. They conflict with each other. Perhaps our addiction may undermine our ambition, or perhaps our obsessions may conflict with our relationships. When we don't get what we want, desire can also very easily turn into hatred, an inverted desire against whatever stands in our way, whether that's against another race, whether it's against adversaries in war, or whether it involves the labelling of a whole race or nation. So what is desire? As often with such questions, it's helpful to start with the brain, not in order to reduce or deny our experience, but to help us understand that experience. Desire appears most basically to come from the back part of our brain, what's often known as the ancient or reptilian brain that we share with many other animals. Particularly, the striatum appears to be one part of the brain that is often involved in motivating desires. However, the striatum and the reptilian brain doesn't just do this by itself. It has a constant interaction with the frontal lobes at the front of our brains, the part of our brain which is much more concerned with consciousness and control, the new brain as it's sometimes called. The frontal lobes control and reinforce those energic impulses that come from the back. When they reinforce it, of course, they are more likely to create new forces in the future, new energy from the back brain. A loop thus develops. Those loops you could take to be synaptic tracks in the brain, connectors between the front and the back. One motivates, the other controls. The other element, though, we have to remember is that those desires are accompanied by beliefs. These are held particularly in the left frontal lobe, which holds representational beliefs. You could describe those beliefs as formatting the desire, in the sense that they provide the background information that we assume to be the case. The information that we assume about the thing that it is that we desire, about what makes it desirable, about all the things we have to do to get it, all the conditions that surround us, as well as the beliefs we have about the value of what it is that we desire. So beliefs are extremely important to us as working together with desire. Desire and belief really don't make sense separately without each other. But of course, none of this takes place in the abstract. There's also a context beyond the brain, an environment. We have experience of conditions, and it's only when those conditions stimulate certain loops in the brain that the desire comes to the fore. So obviously, the appearance of something we might desire, or of conditions that might lead to us, stimulate that loop within us. Let's take an example then. Say we experience a delicious looking chocolate cake. What's going on in our brains then? Well, our left frontal lobes have a belief that this is a cake. They believe the cake is really there and that it's edible. The left frontal lobe also believes that the cake is good. That, together with the drive that comes from the back of the brain, that tendency to crave cake, leads to our decision to eat cake. And every time we make that decision, the feedback loop goes back again to reinforce the tendency to crave cake in the future. Thus, what may have started off as a relatively mild feedback loop becomes much more strongly entrenched One might begin to say, well, I really like cake. I have a strong habitual tendency to eat cake when it's put in front of me. But sometimes the experience of cake may trigger quite a different reaction. Sometimes the belief may occur to us that we should lose weight. That's a bigger contextual belief, but it's one that we may have come across, that may be reinforced by other people, or reinforced by other experiences, like standing on a pair of scales. In that case, exactly the same leap is going on, though it's liable to be rather weaker to start with, at least. My decision in this case is to reject the cake, politely of course, but nevertheless to reject it. And why do I do that? Well, for exactly the same sorts of reasons. I have an accompanying belief, a belief that I should lose weight, and somewhere in the back of my brain there is a tendency to desire long-term health, which is driving me to reject the cake. The more I do reject the cake, of course, the more I'm likely to strengthen that tendency, that possibility, at least, to be able to reject cake in the future. Hence, I may start to experience a conflict between the rejection of cake and the decision to eat cake. In each case, of course, backed up by the accompanying beliefs and the accompanying energies. These two actions are, of course, incompatible. I can't eat cake and reject it at the same time. On some occasions, I may actually be aware of a conflict within myself and have difficulty deciding. On other occasions, I may flip between one position and the other. That suggests that we have two different tracks at work here, two different entrenched loops, and we're moving between those loops when we make different decisions. So what can we do about such conflicts of desire? Well, one thing we can do in the short term, at least, is to try exercises that involve a relaxation of that conflict. A relaxation, indeed, of both sets of loops. If we enter into a slightly different, more relaxed state of consciousness, where we're not focusing on our beliefs or on the desires that accompany them at all, the occasional arising of things associated with them will all be put in the same warm, relaxed pool of awareness. The desire for long-term health, the desire for cake, the rejection and the decision to eat it, all of that's one, at least for the time being. We're not thinking about or craving cake particularly. That suspends the conflict, and it may indeed have beneficial effects in the slightly longer term. It may help us to make a clearer decision about such things in the longer term. However, it's not in itself a long-term solution. It's what we could describe as temporary integration. The longer-term integration of desire is much more closely associated with integration of belief. This can be illustrated by the two mules pictures, which were discussed in some detail in the introductory video in this series on integration. The two mules have contrary desires, but they're able to reconsider those contrary desires by reframing the beliefs that accompany those desires. They can just generate more adequate beliefs, and that helps them, of course, to satisfy each of their desires. So imagine the two mules as representing the two parts of ourselves. There's one part that thinks cake is good, who wants to eat the cake, and the other part that thinks it should lose weight and wants to not eat the cake. They're working against each other in an incompatible way, it seems. Whilst they continue to do that, they are absolutizing their respective beliefs. And that's the link to the middle way here and to the avoidance of absolutization, which the contrary beliefs involved have, that prevent the two mules from reconciling their conflict of desire. In order to become reconciled, the two mules have to reach a point of frustration where they're forced to give up their opposition to each other and come together and reconsider and reframe their beliefs about the situation. In order to be able to work together, though, they're going to have to come up with some joint beliefs, some shared beliefs about the whole situation, which frame each of their apparently opposed previous beliefs. The beliefs about cake might look something like this. Cake is good in moderation for an organism that's otherwise healthy. In the longer term, you won't enjoy cake if you're unhealthy. So that's a set of beliefs that could include the enjoyment of cake, but it could also include and motivate abstention from cake at other times. The two mules, though, will not only have to reframe their beliefs altogether, they'll also have to make practical decisions about what the implications are, how they should act in accordance with their newly reframed joint beliefs. So what should they do? Well, here's one possible suggestion. How about not buying cake so we don't reinforce the loop? Obviously, that doesn't mean we'll never eat cake. Occasionally someone may give us a piece of cake, but if we don't actually buy it when we go to the supermarket or the baker's, then it's much less likely that we'll be tempted by cake on a regular basis. There, the decision only has to be made when shopping, not at every moment when you're tempted by a slice of cake that's hanging around in the house. So the two mules are not just exercising self-control, as the traditional phrase has it. They're integrating their beliefs, which is a more profound and important process. They may occasionally need to suppress their desire for cake in certain circumstances, but they don't have to repress it. They don't have to force themselves to pretend that they don't like cake when they do. Indeed, an integration of belief allows one to more fully appreciate what it is that one desires, indeed to fulfill those desires in a way that's more adequate and more satisfactory in the longer term. Not only do the mules, or the parts of yourself, get the cake, they also get the greater satisfaction in the long term of being healthier, of having the right context in which to enjoy the cake. Here's what that more integrated situation might look like in terms of the brain diagram we started with. First, of course, there's the input of experience of the cake. This has become a little fainter, not because it's any less tasty than it was before, but because it's a little less overpowering. The framing belief is that cake is good in moderation, eaten by a healthy organism. The impulse which comes from the back of the brain is a tendency to enjoy cake in moderation with a sense of perspective. Not that those ideas need to lodge in the back of the brain, but they'll be linked effectively to frontal lobe ideas of that kind. In the frontal lobe, the decision being made will be a decision to buy cake less frequently. The more traditional ways of talking about conflicts of desire often make distinctions between first and second level desires, or good and bad desires, or rational and irrational desires, or enlightened and unenlightened desires. These kinds of dual distinctions are not particularly helpful to the actual resolution of the conflict. So I want to suggest an integration model is far more useful to us. An integration model does not rank desires as being quantitatively different from each other. Desires themselves are just energy, which makes them in themselves morally neutral. But desires are associated with particular beliefs, and it's the beliefs that it's important to focus on. Some of those beliefs address a narrower range of conditions, so they're still useful for addressing conditions to some extent. Others, however, address a wider range of conditions, which is a reason for taking them incrementally more seriously. So the belief that cake is good it does address a narrow range of conditions. It helps you to be nourished with something that's edible and indeed nourishing. But the idea that you should lose weight, assuming that you are overweight, does address a wider range of conditions in the longer term. To integrate desire, we don't have to win a sort of battle of will. Rather, we have to make peace. This becomes increasingly obvious when you scale up the question of the integration of desire to a socio-political level. It becomes clear that in most conditions, the fighting of war against a resistant group is very likely to merely lead to repression and continuing conflict, rather than to a long-term resolution of whatever conditions are causing the conflict. It's thus integration of desire that's a crucial condition for political resolutions of conflicts. This will be discussed in more detail in another video later in this series. The integration of desire is one of three interdependent aspects of integration: the integration of desire, the integration of meaning, and the integration of belief. We've already seen closely in this video the interrelationship between the integrations of desire and the integration of belief. The integration of desire is simply the merging of energies that have previously been opposed to each other, but this can only happen, in the longer term at least, through the reframing of the beliefs that format those desires. However, those beliefs in turn can only be integrated if there's a basis of understanding, a shared basis on which those beliefs can be understood and related to experience. That's where the integration of meaning comes in, which will be the subject of another video in this series. So, to summarise, desire is an energy loop between front and back brain. That is, a set of synaptic connections along which energy flows, both back and forth. It's associated with certain beliefs, and it responds to certain experiences that stimulate movement of energy on that loop. Desires can be said to conflict when we flip between different loops in similar conditions. Conflicts between desires can be temporarily relaxed, for example through meditation, and that may be helpful. However, long-term integration of desire requires the reframing of beliefs so that long-term conditions are addressed in those beliefs. This is not a matter of rational or better desires. Instead, the crucial point is that our desires should all be considered, should all form part of the bigger stream of desire, which is an integrated desire.